I'd like to tell you the story of a fascinating figure who you've probably never heard of, and yet whose story touches on a number of the most important tensions of the Latter-day Saint faith during the mid-20th century. It's a tale of Ebeid Sarofim, an Egyptian convert who wowed LDS authorities. However, while his mental acuities impressed a lot of Mormon leadership, including the prophet, his skin color and marital status caused a pause, or at least questions on their part. And the only reason we know about this whole story is because many LDS leaders, including David O. McKay, the prophet at the time, and Quentin Cook, a later apostle, often spoke about him. And then please stick with me all the way to the end of the story, because I promise there is a twist that's going to surprise you. Let's dig in. Now, David O. McKay was the LDS president and prophet during the 1950s and 60s. He is, to a great degree, one of the most significant, impactful, and charismatic prophets the LDS Church had in the 20th century. He not only presided over 2 decades of massive growth, but his personal exuberance and the devotion that he drew from many followers kind of capitalized or represented this spirit of optimism during the post-World War II era. This is a time when the church doubled in size nearly every 20 years. It was a global expansion in the wake of World War II. They were building chapels almost on a weekly basis. And McKay himself was often impressed by celebrity, or those who he felt could add prestige and esteem to the LDS tradition. And then there was a figure who came in and kind of represented that hope and optimism, as well as some of the lasting legacies. Because you see, at the April 1962 General Conference, Eldon Tanner, who was then the president of the England Mission, gave an update on his efforts. And among the church's success in the nation, he explained, was the conversion of a, quote, very educated and talented young Oxford graduate who had received the gospel and was very smart. He spoke 6 languages. He was educated at Oxford, was now a university professor in London. And among the 6 languages he spoke is Hebrew. But when he was introduced to the Book of Mormon, according to Tanner, he exhibited a childlike faith. Now, remarkably, among those missionaries who taught Ebeid Sarofim was his name. Among the missionaries who taught Serafin was a young Quentin Cook, who has since become an LDS apostle. And he has twice talked about Serafin, once in his April 2012 General Conference talk, and then more recently in a 2023 worldwide devotional for young adults, saying that Serafin had taught them not just how you can be educated and accept the gospel, but he introduced some Hebrew interpretations of Book of Mormon scriptures like, and it came to pass, trying to provide some intellectual credibility for Mormon scripture. They'll all note that maybe at some point in the future I'll talk about the disputes among apologists and critics over these types of interpretation. But what's important is Serafin's conversion represented a high watermark for the LDS Church during the era. This is a time that the faith was finally taken seriously, even on an international stage, even by Oxford-trained professors. So David O. McKay started a correspondence with Serafin. It's not so often that a convert gets to correspond with the prophet, but McKay sent him a signed photograph and invited him to visit the church in the October 1862 General Conference. The leaders even started discussing making Serafin a BYU professor. And we know all this, by the way, because David O. McKay kept remarkable diaries, or at least his assistant Claire Middlemiss did, which were published by Signature Books in a book titled Confidence Amid Change, the Diaries of David O. McKay, that I strongly recommend. They're a fascinating snapshot of LDS leadership in the 1950s and 1960s. But with this great optimism of this wonderful Oxford-educated professor, there soon came problems. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of analysis, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, like and share the videos you find useful so we can broaden the discussion. Every Monday I do deep dives on historical topics. Wednesdays I connect the past to the present, and on Fridays I peel back the curtain to talk about a historical or historiographical issue so that you can understand how history is performed. And I'm also, because I've had so much fun in recent live Q&A events, I'm going to make them a monthly staple. Every first Wednesday of the month, I am going to do a live Q&A here on my YouTube page, discussing the previous videos of the past month, or just general news and issues going on in American religion, especially Mormonism, but politics and history writ large. So the next live discussion is going to take place Wednesday, November 5th, and I'm going to do it at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm hoping the evening start time is going to allow more people who can't otherwise tune in during the day. So mark your calendar, November 5th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm going to do my next live event, and that's going to be a monthly thing every first Wednesday. All right, let's get back to today's story. So let's talk about the problems and why this Ensign story-esque conversion of an Oxford-trained professor willing to talk about the divine authenticity of the Book of Mormon, why he wasn't baptized as soon as he converted. Well, there were two problems. First, he was from Egypt, and Egypt is an African country, and therefore there was a question of, is he barred from the priesthood due to his African ancestry? And LDS leaders even debated, should we even baptize those of African ancestry if they're not going to be able to fully participate in the gospel? Now, there's a few complications to this. First, Egypt has always held a difficult, complicated place within the mental and racial imaginations of those creating these racial hierarchies, where there's a question of whether those from Egypt count as African or are they close enough to Europe. Church leaders debated about that, and in the end concluded that those from Egypt were counted as African ancestry. There was also an issue connected to the race that the church was dealing with civil rights protests at the time, and they worried that if they made public this conversion of an Egyptian scholar, it's going to cause the NAACP, who have been doing some protests and public demonstrations in the church, that would add more grist to the public discussion. So leaders didn't know if they should baptize him, and if they did, whether they should make it public. And they debated those very questions in meetings. The other second major issue with Ebeid Sarofin's conversion is that he was raised in Egypt, practiced law in Cairo, where he married his first wife, but then he moved to Europe for an education to get more degrees, and at some point married a second wife without ever getting a divorce from his first wife, who remained in Cairo. In other words, he was deemed to be a polygamist, and the church didn't know if they could baptize him given his polygamous status. This was at the same time that they were dealing with the Mormon fundamentalist movement and trying to distance themselves from the fundamentalist past. So they actually debated, could we baptize this guy, knowing that he is, with all in the legal sense, a polygamist? That was another issue that they debated in the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 meetings. Now, eventually, Serafin did make it out to Utah to attend the October 1962 General Conference. If I said 1862 earlier, that's because I live in the 19th century. The 1962 General Conference. He met David O. McKay, provided him a gorgeous copy of the Arabic Quran. McKay found him witty and charming. He gushed about him in his diaries. And then, however, shortly afterward, they did get further confirmation of their worst fears, that Serafin had never informed his wife of his second marriage. And so they decided not to authorize baptism until that was resolved. Now, refusing baptism for a guy who was married to the first wife and did not alert the first wife of his marriage to a second wife, you can go ahead and insert your Joseph Smith joke here, but I'm not going to do that. I'm above that kind of a joke. And then another issue came up, because at the very same time that they are debating Serafin's conversion, and they debate his conversion and baptism at several church leadership meetings, they're also discussing what to do with these growing numbers of potential converts in West Africa. Here's a photograph of one of these groups who wanted to be baptized, wanted to have missionaries sent, but the church did not know what to do given the faith's racial restriction. It was in one of these meetings, by the way, that McKay said, well, Serafin is from Africa and he's a polygamist. How do we know not all these other Africans are polygamous? Kind of feeding into these racial assumptions that was quite common among many white Americans at the time. In the end, they concluded that Serafin's status was different than the fundamentalists, and that they did not have to worry about whether he could get sealed to one wife or the other, because they determined that he was of African ancestry and therefore could not be ordained to the priesthood. But those debates did result in church leadership. This is one of the causes. There were several other causes, civil rights protests, racism within church leadership, that they decided to call off sending missionaries to West Africa. But that still leaves what happens to Ebeid Sarofim. So in early 1963, the first friends in the Quorum of the 12 get the news that they were hoping to hear that Serafin had been in contact with his first wife. They decided to have a civil divorce, so to speak, to resolve that issue. So there's no longer this polygamous question overhead. So they okayed him getting baptized, though they did determine he could not be ordained to the priesthood given his racial background. They also decided not to offer him a BYU professor job, something they had been discussing earlier, because again, they were worried about introducing an someone with African ancestry to BYU. This is at the same time that they are debating whether they can allow students from Africa or even African American students to attend BYU. That's a topic for another video. Then later, in late 1963 or early 1964, Ebeid Sarofim becomes a bit of a Mormon celebrity in Britain. He goes on a speaking tour, speaking at a number of firesides and devotionals, testifying in the Book of Mormon. Quentin Cook probably arranged or participated in this, and one of these sessions, one of these firesides that Serafin delivers, was in London at their newly developed chapel there, and missionaries attended. It was a gathering for missionaries to hear about the divinity of the Book of Mormon from this Oxford-educated scholar who had just been baptized and was willing to defend the authenticity of the Book of Mormon text. But while they were fascinated in that, the missionaries also started hearing the rumors about his background and marital status and how he was kind of quasi-polygamous, and that the church was willing to move beyond that. One of those missionaries in attendance kind of placed that on a shelf and decided, I want to return to that. I want to understand the faith's complicated relationship or continuing relationship with polygamy. So when he would return from his missionary in England, he would go back to BYU, and he decided that he was going to dig into that topic. That missionary's name? D. Michael Quinn. Anyways, that's the story of Ebeid Sarofim. You might be wondering, what then happened to him? I don't know. I and several other scholars have tried to dig into this guy's background without much luck. If you are a PhD student, especially if you're based out in the UK, this is your assignment. Go out and find more about Serafin and finish this story, because I think it's fascinating. I love this story because it touches on so many important issues: the optimism of church growth, the power of LDS conversion, debates over Book of Mormon authenticity, race connected to conversion, fears over polygamy. This story has it all, as well as the origin story of one of modern Mormonism's most important historians. I hope you found this story interesting? If so, please hit the like button and share. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so yet. And if you want to give back, consider becoming a member, which gives you early access to the videos. And please mark your calendar for Wednesday, November 5th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, where I will be doing a live session. History has never been more relevant than it is at the present, because not only does it provide these fun stories, but it can remind us of these disputes and disagreements that took place in the past, and these elements that we might assume have always been settled, but certainly weren't. In other words, these stories matter, which is why I'm thrilled to share them with you.